So I guess it's not surprising that a lot of my work, not all of my work, is quite colorful, and I take great delight in using color. I spent the first 12 years of my life in Jamaica, and then I was sent to boarding school in England, and had all my formal education in England, and came to Canada in 1973 as a newly fledged chartered accountant. And although that was my profession for about 30 years, I continued to paint while I was at school, and latterly while I was a CA in practice. And I guess along the piece, I got quite a lot of positive reinforcement. When I was at school, masters bought my painting, and when I was in practice, I used to give my paintings to charitable auctions, and they fetched some money. So that was all quite encouraging. Anyway, when I got to, I guess, after 30 years at the age of 53, I was fortunate to be able to make the numbers work, and I retired. And at that point, I decided to sort of get really serious about my art. Until that point, I'd sort of been a weekend painter. I should say that I guess I've always been, I suppose, what you would call a natural drawer. So, if you give me a piece of paper and a pencil, I can sit down and sort of, draw a reasonable likeness of something on a scene. That side of things is quite easy for me. And again, I got a lot of encouragement along the way. Why do I paint, and why do I paint what I paint? Well, I guess I paint because I suppose I cannot not paint. I have to paint. If I don't paint, if I don't nurture myself, I'm not happy after a while. So I paint because I have to. And I also paint, as I mentioned, because people seem to like what I do, and so if they like what you do, you keep doing it. Now, why do I paint what I paint? That's a more difficult question. I think I have to go to my notes for that one. Well, primarily I'm a landscape painter, as you can see, although I do other things. And I suppose I'm a landscape painter because of my formative years. I grew up in Jamaica. Jamaica is a very hilly place, and we lived on top of the hill, and surrounded by fields and some woods. And so I have been, as opposed to growing up in a neighborhood, in an urban environment, I grew up in a very sort of pastoral environment, I suppose. So I've always been fed by nature, and nature feeds my soul. I'm also a religious person and a spiritual person, and for me, nature feeds my soul. And I guess to just continue in that vein for a moment, I see painting in a way as a form of worship, and so in a sense giving back to the Creator what the Creator has given to me in the first instance. So that's why I paint. And why I paint what I paint. But as you look around you, there are an infinite number of subjects that you could paint. You could frame, just what do you frame and why? What do you paint? And I guess this too is spiritual in a way. I have to be moved to paint what I paint. I don't think I could ever be the painter's equivalent of the poet laureate and, paint things because they were celebrating national events or something. I mean, I paint what I paint because I'm moved by the subject matter. And what else can I say about it? Maybe a good example, I can give you a couple of examples. The painting over there, which is a painting of two canoes, when we were up at Belmont Lodge in Algonquin Park. It was the very end of the season. Most of the canoes had been brought out of the water. They were packing up. Those two canoes were there. And I suppose in the first instance, I was drawn to the shape of them. They're slightly looking at that red mass in the middle. I was drawn to the shape of those canoes as a whole. And then I thought about them, and I thought about togetherness, and I imagine you've had the experience of lying very close to someone and noticing how well you fit together as two bodies. There's a sense of unity. And it seemed to me that those canoes also had that sense of togetherness and of unity, and for that reason I call the painting spooning. But that gives you a clue as to why I painted it. Now I'll talk about this one. This painting, and I'll use this one just to tell you a little bit about my process. This painting is of the St. And just to set the scene, Don and I took a car trip in the fall of 2014, no, the late summer, after the studio tour anyway, third week of September. And we drove along the South Shore from, well, Quebec City over to Rivière de Loup before we turned south. And if you've done that, you'll know that you see the river intermittently all the way along there. And I just found myself drawn to the river. It was very magnetic. I couldn't keep my eyes on it. It was very majestic, for one thing. But also, I was particularly drawn to the mountains that were the backdrop for the far shore. And it was the color of the water, and also particularly the colors of the mountains, that drew my attention. I felt I had to paint. I paint either from very quick pencil sketches, or photographs, or both. This piece was done purely from photographs because I didn't have time to do a pencil sketch. Obviously, pencil sketches will give you perhaps a greater sense of depth. But if you're careful, and you can get the same sense of depth from a photograph if you try hard. So, what do? I've got these source materials. I transfer them to, watercolor paper very quickly with a pencil. I use this is more for the artists than it is for perhaps everyone, but I thought there are a few artists here who are interested, so I'll tell you. I work on very heavy 300-pound Arches paper, and I do that because when it dries, it doesn't warp. And also, it is so strong and resilient that if I make a mistake, there are sometimes you can correct those mistakes. Generally, watercolor is quite unforgiving, but with very good paper, you can correct some problems. So,
sorry, can you jump for a second? Did you say you moved this whole bush several times?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. I also, I take liberties. Doris McCarthy took liberties when she did her paintings too. So in this painting, for example, I thought the composition would be strengthened if I had a branch there. So in the original photograph, this trunk went straight up. So I introduced this kind of branch there, and this bush was not really in the right place, so I moved that. Just that's one of the privileges,
You didn't need a shovel?
No, and I didn't need to Photoshop. So anyway, I thank you for reminding me. So I transfer the image, and then I basically work. Am I going on too long?
No, I'm fascinated.
There are really kind of three principles or beliefs that kind of underpin what I do, or the approach I take. The first one is that the strength of a painting is largely in the relationship between large, strong shapes. It's not in fussy detail, for me anyway. So if you get the big shapes right, the painting will have a strength. Secondly, that the value relationships, the lights and darks, the relationship between the lights and darks of those shapes and the space in between is very important. And if you get those right, the painting will have a real presence. There will be a rightness, a truth about it. And so I work very, very hard to get these light and dark relationships correct. And then thirdly, I do a lot of paint mixing, because with the possible exception of skies, colors in nature don't come out of tubes of paint without being mixed. So I do quite a lot of mixing. And I'll give you, in the case of this painting, I would say to myself, what is the focal point? What is the subject? What has drawn me to this in the first instance? And in this case, it's the river and the mountains. So I look at the photograph in this case, and I never match colors with photographs. I let the photograph remind me of the moment and of my sense of the color of the moment. I mean, I will never forget the color of those mountains on the far side of the St. Lawrence. And I will go back and I will do more paintings of them. Because I haven't quite got it right. This is pretty good, but I think I can get it better. Anyway, so I have that color in my mind, and then I let that become, if you will, the key to the painting. That color, or that one or two colors, become the keys to the painting. And then, so in this case, it's cobalt blue and it's ultramarine. Ultramarine, neither of those two colors would give me the mountains that I want, colored mountains, so I introduced cobalt violet, for those of you who are interested, and a bit of sort of bright pink. And that got me to the color of the mountains that I wanted. And this is more cobalt blue. So then, if you're familiar with color theory, those colors have complements. And so, having set the key, if you will, those complements, together with those paintings, will give me quite nice natural greens and blues and shadows and so on. So then I mixed all these paints and produced the greens that you see, and the dark trunk, which was ultramarine, and raw sienna, which is one of the complements. Anyway, mixed all those, produced the painting. It's about 80% complete at this point. And then I say to myself, yeah, it's pretty good, but it really lacks brilliance. It lacks, the brilliance that I'm looking for. So then what I do is I do glazes or washes in the case of a watercolor. What did I do? I wanted this foreground to be brighter than everything else, and so I washed a pigment called Intense Green, which is produced by De La Rowney, which is a really bright color on its own. But anyway, layered over these natural colors just made that foreground glow more. I introduced manganese blue into the sky, because actually sky is one of the exceptions where I say you don't take the pigments out of the tube. I think if you look at the sky, you'll see ultramarine, you'll see cobalt blue, and you'll see cerulean blue, and you'll see manganese blue, and so on. And some of those pigments can be used straight out of the tube into the sky. But for the most part, I don't do that. Anyway, I introduced manganese blue into the sky, and then that was getting me close. And then I decided finally that I wanted to accentuate the relationship between, you might say, the cool part of the painting and the warm part of the painting. And so these shadowy parts, the cool parts over here, I glazed over with ultramarine blue, which is, and then I washed over the warm parts of the painting with a pigment called quinacridone gold, which is sort of related to ultramarine blue. And that gave the painting the kind of warmth that I was looking for. And at that point it was finished. So there you go. I hope I didn't go on too long with that. I hope gives you some sense of the kind of thought which goes behind the painting. And at this point...
Two quick questions?
Yes.
Are we allowed to ask
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Love
so
it.
is there, I'm not a Cajun. Is there cobalt blue in the rockery? How do we get that? So there's almost like a bluish dark gray black.
Where are we?
Or is it just shadow on the,
Right
right
there?
there, for instance. Did you use the blue again from the river a little bit in there?
I would have used ultramarine blue
Yeah,
there.
okay.
And maybe, because I wanted to have a darker value, which it required, I may have mixed some indigo in there, which I don't really like, except it's a very dark blue. It's very staining, so it's a bit dangerous. but in a limited way, it does what you want it to do.
I like the way it resonates with
And I think, I
you.
suspect I've also got some of the burnt sienna in that blue as well.
And the other question was, you said working from a photograph, you prefer to not work from a
Right.
photograph, but working from a photograph is more challenging in terms of rediscovering the depth of the painting. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Well, I'm not,
To a non-painter, like
I
I
don't understand optics, and I'm not a photographer. So my knowledge, you know, if there's a photographer here, they'll probably correct me, and that's fine. But the camera lens is obviously, you know, it only has one eye, not two, right? So that's the problem. Partially, I believe, I never use the zoom on my camera to take anything that I'm going to paint, right? What I do is I take the picture from very far away, and then to the extent that I want to focus on an area of the painting, I might then crop it, and that the result is that it's not as flat as it would otherwise be, but I don't think it's quite as deep as, for example, this which was done from a sketch. I have to say this show is more about color and than it is about, you know, realism, I suppose. Anyone else? Yes.
When you sort of flatten the landscape, sorry Meryl, I'm just going to give you a check here. Do you find when you move to a different media like acrylic and you start adding a whole bunch of texture, does that make the complexity more challenging for you, or is that something you really take on and...
Well, that's an interesting one, because this painting, which is probably the closest, is a painting where I tried to take this style or technique and move it into acrylics, right?
Okay.
I'm still working on that because I really like the color relationships. But I find that if I compare the two, the watercolor just by nature of the medium has a softness and a gentleness almost by virtue of the medium that doesn't. And I haven't quite found a way to introduce that kind of...
So then is the next painting like a graduation from that, where you're introducing texture to see if you like working with acrylic with this?
Right. Anyone else? I love talking, so
You do a lot of abstract painting. I'm sorry, I've been so excited for this talk. You do a lot of abstract work as well. And there's a huge difference between your abstract work, which almost looks like found objects that you've incorporated in, and the landscape work. And maybe you could just touch upon those two different inspirations and...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose these paintings are outside-in paintings. I'm looking at the world and, you know, trying to represent it. Comes through my brain, if you will, and then hopefully add some spirit to it, and it comes out onto the paper. My abstract work is really inside out, in the sense that I start with nothing. I start with, you know, blank canvas, and I have found objects in my studio, and I simply, you know, it emerges out of my subconscious, really, and I simply manipulate the materials and their in the relationships between them until they have a unity. And that can happen quickly, or it can take a long time, but it's quite remarkable, and this is not unique to me. I think lots of artists would say this, that, you know, it's such a moment of excitement when you've manipulated all these things and suddenly it just pops. It's just like the last little screw, if you're using nuts and screws, or a dab of paint that simply makes the whole thing sort of unified, and that's very exciting. Don't go there very often, but I'm a member of the Arts and Letters Club in Toronto, and I think twice a week they have these drawing. You know, you can go up and draw a figure on the third floor, and I did that, and in behind here there's the face of one of the figures that I drew. And at this time I was doing pieces of art that played with these children's bricks, basically. And I was exploring the surface plane of the work, but also the space between the surface plane and the wall. And so this is very three-dimensional. So I took that drawing and I took these blocks and I arranged them and moved them around and introduced this veiling with which these are actually, you know what this is? This is, I'm not a fisherman, but if you fish and you have live bait, you tie it up in these little gauze bags, and then you attach the lure and then you drag it. And anyway, this kind of gauze is what you tie up the bait in. Anyway, I found this lovely stuff in the fishing department of Canadian Tire. And at that time I was really enamored with this kind of shocking pink. Anyway, so you know, I had some of that in my studio, so I used that to veil pieces of this. And this is earplugs, and they twist the way through. Anyway, long story. What's it about? I don't know. I called it Mind Loser because either I was going to lose my mind, or the person in the piece had lost their mind, and this kind of represented, you know, broken circuits of some kind. So but anyway, you know what? Sometimes this kind of work, I have done work which is in a way more pointed, but when I do this kind of work, I sort of like, first of all, creating a piece that visually, and from a point of view as a composition, is pleasing from a distance. And then, as you get closer to it, it reveals itself more and more. And some of the work actually can be quite disturbing as you get closer. You know, the idea of beauty and horror and so on. So sometimes that's what happens. But anyway, that sort of gives you an idea of what this work is about.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, so I mean, you can always stay and ask Andrew in person if you don't want to talk in front of the crowd. But I'd like to thank Andrew so much for coming and talking with us. It was just lovely.
Thank you.